I just drove a brand new 2023 Honda Pilot EXL, and I'm going to compare that vehicle to a Kia Telluride in this video and talk about the steering, suspension, engine, NVH, and the differences, a few wild cards that I see between them, and ultimately why I am going to buy a new Pilot instead of a Telluride. Just to give you a little context of where my viewpoint is coming from, I've been driving for 20 years or so, and I've driven a lot of vehicles. I love cars. Currently own a 2022 Subaru BRZ and a 2006 Toyota Sequoia, which is going to be replaced by the Honda Pilot that we eventually buy. So, driven a bunch of cars, know quite a bit about cars, and here's my take between the 2023 Honda Pilot and the 2023 Kia Telluride. First thing to compare is the steering between the two. When I drove the Honda Pilot a few days ago, it was literally the first thing I noticed when I got in that vehicle and pulled out of the parking lot, is just how light the steering is. And I'm talking lightness of, what you'd remember from a 1990s or early 2000s Buick Park Avenue or LeSabre. It is truly one finger steering if you want it to be. The Telluride is also light, but it does require a little more effort than the Pilot, but still it's going to be very easy to steer on the parking lot. Both of these cars basically have no steering feel or road feel when they're on the road. It's super numb, so there's just not a whole lot being transmitted from the tires to the steering wheel there. It's a very insulated and disconnected road feel from the steering wheel in both vehicles, but the Pilot steering is a little bit lighter. Second thing I'll talk about is the suspension setup between the two of them. The Telluride is based on the platform that is shared with the Kia Carnival, which is their minivan, and the Honda Pilot, the brand new one, shares a platform with the current generation MDX and has a little more sophisticated suspension architecture from what I've read about it. That was kind of confirmed in the driving I did. Both are very soft vehicles and give a good ride on almost all pavement types. But when it came to larger expansion joints or large potholes, the Honda Pilot seemed a little more composed and better damped than the Kia Telluride. I feel like the Honda Pilot also had a little more body control than the Telluride. That's not to say the Telluride was bad, but the Pilot feels a little bit more confidence inspiring on the roads. So that's in a straight line and going over nice pavement and some rough spots. Also, when you get in the turns, you can tell the Honda Pilot is just a little more confidence inspiring in the turns because of that reduced body roll, in my opinion. Neither of them are sports cars by any stretch, and they're not meant to be hustled around corners, but there's a little more confidence that I felt in the Honda Pilot over the Telluride. Both ride nice, but it seems like the Pilot is set up a little bit better. Next up to compare is the engine and the transmission between the two. The Kia has a naturally aspirated 3.8 liter V6 that's just under 300 horsepower and about 260 some odd foot-pounds of torque. The Honda Pilot, the brand new one, has 282 horsepower, I believe, and 262, same as the Telluride, foot-pounds of torque as well. The Honda Pilot is Honda's kind of legacy, based on their legacy 3.5 liter V6, which they've been producing for decades, which is known for its reliability. So we'll see how it lasts in this new generation of Honda Pilot. Both engines are really smooth when they're just idling. In fact, it's hard to tell if they're even on or not unless you're looking at the tachometer on the dashboard. The Telluride has a little bit of a growl, and actually so does the Honda Pilot when you really get on it. Neither engine is super powerful down low. There's not much down low torque. They're both naturally aspirated V6s, and so that kind of makes sense in both of those. The Honda Pilot feels a little more eager around town at lower speeds. And I think that may be due to the transmission that the Honda Pilot has. The Honda Pilot has 2 more gears. It's a 10-speed automatic, and the Kia Telluride has an 8-speed automatic. So those closer gear ratios may help out the Honda Pilot in feeling a little more spry around town. The Pilot feels a little quicker to me just based on the short 20-minute drive that I did around town and on the highway. It seems like both vehicles have really good powertrains for what they are and are going to be totally adequate for moving families and towing small trailers around town and on the highway. But the Pilot does feel a little more eager to move out of its own way at all speeds. Next thing to compare is braking. Now, I was just driving these around town and on the highway. I did not do any threshold braking or get into ABS even closely. So this impression is just based on what I've felt around town at speeds under 70 miles per hour in casual driving. These two are very similar here. The brake pedal feel is very light, much like the steering in both vehicles too. This Honda Pilot brakes like a traditional feel that you'd have in most Hondas. It's very touchy around low speeds, and it takes a second to get used to, but it is easy to get used to once you spend a few minutes there. Very low input, and just like the steering, which I think is intentional to keep the stress levels down and just keep the cabin isolated and low stress for the driver. The Kia Telluride is much the same. The brakes are pretty touchy at parking lot speeds and seem adequate, just like the Pilot at highway speeds. Next thing to compare is the NVH, which is the noise, vibration, and harshness between both vehicles. Just for some context, the Tellurides I've driven were the EX, SX, and SX Prestige, which all have 20-inch tires and all should have the same level of sound deadening materials and insulated glass. The Honda Pilot I drove was an EXL, which supposedly has the insulated glass, although I found it very interesting. It wasn't dual laminated glass on the side windows. When I rolled down the window, there was only one pane of glass, even though it's supposed to have the insulated glass. I wonder if the insulated glass is just on the windshield in the Honda Pilot and not on the side windows, like in the Telluride. I was very interested to see how the Pilot compared to the Telluride in this category, because this is a really important category to me, because the intended use for us as a family for this vehicle is going to be easy cruising and around town family driving. So I want as easy and low stress as possible as far as that goes. And I'm happy to say the Pilot was very good. Better than I was expecting, although it did have its own set of noises, and just like the Telluride. And just let me explain. So the Honda Pilot, it was very quiet at, I would say, speeds below 40 miles per hour around town. But after that, it started to pick up, and you could hear some wind noise from around the windshield area. There was a little bit of tire noise, but the majority of the noise was from wind noise around the windshield. It's important to note I was driving a Pilot EXL, which did not have a sunroof. So really the roof was flat and there was no chance for any noise, wind noise, to come through a sunroof for me on that Pilot. The Telluride was quieter in terms of wind noise, but I would say it was a little bit louder as far as just overall road noise. When you're driving by semis and other cars, it seemed like there is more noise from those on the interstate that came into the cabin versus the Honda Pilot. So just to recap on the noise, the Pilot has more wind noise and the Telluride has more ambient road noise and traffic noise. Each vehicle is quiet enough to carry on a normal conversation at highway speeds with the passenger that's sitting next to you. The other thing I'll compare are the driver assist features, which to me, the most important things are lane keep assist and the adaptive cruise control, or radar cruise control, as some people say. So the Telluride, all Kia products and Hyundai products are known to have very good driver assist packages. They are programmed very well and calibrated very well. They'll stay in the lanes very well. They won't ping pong back and forth, and they're pretty smooth overall. It's not recommended to do this, but in the Telluride, you can have the vehicle will allow you to have your hands off the steering wheel for probably what seems like 30 to 45 seconds before it asks you to intervene a little bit and touch the steering wheel to let it know that you're still driving and paying attention. The Telluride on the higher trims will automatically change lanes too, but I didn't find this extremely helpful because it takes a while to make sure that there's no cars in the way, and it doesn't execute a lane change extremely quickly. And so I just found that I'd rather change lanes when I want to instead of wait for the car to try to decide that it was okay to change lanes. That's on the Telluride. The Honda Pilot also has lane keep assist and adaptive cruise control. I wasn't sure what to expect on this because there's not a whole lot of reviews on this system from Honda that I could find. but I was actually pleasantly surprised. I was expecting it to be really bad, and I'm happy to say that it was actually pretty good. The lane keep assist in the Pilot wasn't quite as calibrated and composed as the Telluride. It did bounce back and forth a little bit more than the Telluride. Sometimes it would want to veer to the exit ramp even though I was going straight and did not have a turn signal on. So it does take a little more intervention on the Pilot, but it was very good. And there were some 40-mile-per-hour turns that I took. It held the turn very well and with little intervention from me. But overall, when it comes to driving assist features, I would say the Telluride definitely wins this. It's superior to the Pilot, but the Pilot is still has a good system in place, and I was pleasantly surprised. All right, so a few last things to note between the two for me. First thing is the steering wheel, the actual design of the steering wheels. So the Telluride has a 4-spoke, which leaves the very bottom section, the 6 o'clock section, open to rest your hand in when you're cruising. I like this a lot. I don't see why all car companies are doing this, especially for their vehicles that are targeted for, that are meant for, intended for highway cruising and just general around town driving. The Honda Pilot has a 3-spoke wheel, so there's a spoke here and straight down. So you can't rest your hand on the bottom of the steering wheel. It's always going to be off to the side one way and running into the spoke. So I definitely prefer the Telluride steering wheel for those reasons. The next thing that I was curious about to look at on the Pilot was the black levels of the gauge cluster. I really dislike when a gauge cluster is black but still emitting a lot of light, especially at night when you're driving, because it's very distracting and makes it harder to see out of the windshield. I drove the Pilot at dusk and into the evening, and I was pleasantly surprised at the black levels on the Honda Pilot. It looked very good and it wasn't distracting at all. It also seemed to dim very well, and so I would say the Pilot screen is very good in that regard. The Telluride was a little bit brighter even in the dark black levels, but not a deal killer at all. Another thing about the gauge cluster in both vehicles. So one thing I really disliked about the Telluride when I drove it, every time I test drove one, was that I could never get my steering wheel and seating position adjusted in a way that was comfortable to me, that allowed me to see the gauge cluster in front of me. The gauge cluster was always cut off, or the gauge cluster was always sitting behind the top of the steering wheel on how I like to drive. I don't have a weird driving position. I think it's fairly normal. But to see the top of the gauge cluster, which had, your speedometer and your tachometer, I had to duck down to see under the steering wheel. And I think that's because the Telluride's screen is too high on the dashboard. It doesn't allow you to put the steering wheel down that's more flat to you. You have to have it angled up to be able to see the gauge cluster, which is pretty frustrating. Not a deal breaker, but it's frustrating when you know it's right there, but you just can't see it. On the other hand, the Honda Pilot, the ergonomics there were perfect as far as the ability to adjust the steering wheel and the seat to levels I like them and see the gauge cluster and have a great view out. So it was great on the Pilot, really bad on the Telluride. Probably not a deal breaker on the Telluride, but could get frustrating after a while if you like to have your steering wheel more flat to you versus angled up like a bus. The other thing I'll comment on regarding screens is the infotainment screen for both vehicles. Now, one of my big complaints with the Honda, and one of the reasons I almost pretty much ruled it out when I saw the interior photos a few weeks ago, was because of the little tiny 9-inch screen, infotainment screen, and that's on the high trim levels, the 8-inch on the lower trim levels. The Telluride has a 12.3-inch screen standard across all trim levels for the infotainment system. So when I got in the Pilot, I was expecting to really feel like it was inadequate and not even close to what the Telluride offered there. However, even though it is a small screen, especially for a vehicle that you can option over $50,000 in 2023, the 9-inch infotainment screen in the Pilot actually was pretty good. And that's due to the placement both vertically and proximity to the driver and the passenger. It's pretty much right there within arm's reach. You don't really have to bend forward to touch it. It's a touch screen, and it's high up on the dashboard. Not high enough that it gets in the view of the road in front of you, but just under where the top of the far side of the hood view would be. So that's a big benefit in the Pilot, because you don't really have to take your eyes off the road hardly at all to glance at that infotainment screen, because it's right there below your field of vision when you're driving normally. So that wasn't as big of an issue as I thought it was going to be based on the initial pictures of the Pilot that I had seen. The Telluride is a great screen, has a great infotainment screen. It's 12.3 inches diagonal, like I mentioned. It's huge and it looks really cool too. It is lower in the dashboard, so you do have to take your eyes off the road a little bit more than in the Honda Pilot to view it, but I would say it's a nice screen too. One other thing to note about the screens is that the Telluride is a glossy finish and the Pilot is a matte finish. I prefer a matte finish. It looked nicer and a little more high end, but you'll notice the difference between the glossiness in both of those screens too. Last thing to note quickly between the two, and this isn't a huge deal, but it's something to be aware of, is the Honda Pilot does have wireless CarPlay and Android Auto, whereas the Telluride, you have to plug in your phone to use the CarPlay and Android Auto. Both vehicles have wireless charging when you get into upper trims, so they're equal that way. But if you just want to get in your car and keep your phone in your pocket and still have your CarPlay or Android Auto on your screen, you have to get the Honda Pilot because that's the only one that's wireless. To sum it up, I'm gonna buy the Pilot over the Telluride like I mentioned before. When you get in the Pilot, and my wife commented on this too before we even said anything to each other, we both got it and she said, this just feels like a nicer, higher quality vehicle than the Telluride. The layout is great and the materials and the fit and finish just seem like a cut above what the Telluride is offering. The Telluride offers some great things and has some near luxury features that the Pilot doesn't, like the LCD rear view mirror. That's not available on the Pilot at any trim level. The Telluride also has heated and cooled second row seats optional, where even the highest end Pilot only has heated second row seats. But overall, for what I need in an SUV and what I value as far as driving dynamics and fit and finish and ergonomics, the Pilot beats the Telluride, and that's why I'm going to be spending my money on a 2023 Honda Pilot and not a 2023 Kia Telluride.